Our first speaker today is Mr. J.W. Roundhill, and he's a recipient of the French Legion of Honor, and he flew many bombing runs over Germany during World War II. He was a crewman and a bombardier on the B-17, and Mr. Roundhill was born August 1st, 1923. Mr. Roundhill?
I have a different perspective probably than most of what you're going to hear today, was because I was in England, had gone to school there, and had been currently on this infamous day an apprentice at an aircraft factory called Phillips and Palace, who made the Miles Master and the Miles Magister airplanes for the training command, the RAF training command. So as I go through this discussion, you'll pick up the ideas to what I was doing about the time of Pearl Harbor. So soon there will be Pearl Harbor Day, which is this coming Wednesday. For some time there had been uneasiness throughout the world. If I don't read, I'm going to get carried away into some other subject, and you'll be here when it's time to turn on Channel 7 tonight at 7 o'clock, so we don't want to do that. So I'm going to read as much of this as I can in order to keep myself confined. A lot of folks here today know how I run off at the mouth quite often, and I get sidetracked from one way to another. We're not going to do that today. I've done that for the last 60 years, talking, public speaking, like I'm doing today. For some time, there had been uneasiness throughout the world. Two island nations, Japan was on the brutal offensive in the Pacific, and the other, Great Britain, on the defensive on the Atlantic side. Both needed to rule the ocean waves in order to support their countrymen, because neither one of them had able to be able to supply all the food and the materials and the oil and the necessary equipment and materials to be able to put together a war machine. On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Hawaiian time was a sorrowful day in the U.S. with a mixture of joy throughout the rest of the world. A mixture of joy. Japan was joyful. The Allies were somewhat joyful. At last, America may hear the bugle. The post-World War I was reconstruction of humanity and living conditions were slow to come by. Depression hit most of the world, with some workers paid off with wheelbarrows full of depressed coin. Some knew that World War I armistice was only a temporary stop measure to another world conflict. And so, in the 1930s, 10 years after signing of the armistice and getting all that out of the way, the eggshell of land grabbing began to fracture. Hitler became restless for the return of land given to the Allies, with German citizens enclosed therein. As Tojo and his bunch grabbed Manchuria, Mussolini had already grabbed a whole bunch of North Africa. Like Japan, Italy also had a need to move their people from crowded cities to new lands of opportunity. In September 1939, World War II had started in Europe 2 years before America heard the bugle. The Dunkirk evacuation. Now, a lot of these names, a lot of these terms I'm using, go home if you wish and look them up in Google. Google's got all this information in much more detail than I can possibly tell you today. Dunkirk, evacuation of the defensive forces of the Allies from France and Belgium had come and gone, leaving valiant underground movements behind to hinder the enemy. The Battle of Britain fought and won by the brilliant RAF. Many dispatches mentioned the heroics of the pilots at great odds, some surviving one day and downed or missing the next. England required 90% or so of its needs to be imported. Seas of the world were its lifeline. German submarines and their battleships controlled many of the vast waters. England was on its back as best it could, fighting back as best it could. Some Royal Navy battleships and an aircraft carrier became lost to the cause and now lay on the ocean bottom. Imported food from the U.S. and the colonies were in short supply. Lend-lease equipment from the U.S. helped Britain continue, but the German Navy was hampering their arrival. It was a mess, and Britain prayed that the U.S. would soon come to the rescue. They knew that Roosevelt wanted to enter the war, but faced much opposition in Congress and from fellow citizens. We were all a bunch of doves. World War I did not do us any good. Our men came home not to a GI Bill where they would have housing and medical treatment and maybe compensation a little bit that could continue for 3 to 6 months. None of that was going on after World War I. There were riots, no, I'm getting carried away. Let me go back to my speech here. During the war, once war broke out in England, ever since World War II, they operated on my nose. I've had to have a handkerchief handy ever since. The military here in the United States had observers over in England at the headquarters at Whitehall and various other places, Portsmouth and what have you, looking over the shoulders of what was going on from a military point of view, getting themselves kind of prepared for what was going to be an eventual war. As their hosts would allow, the U.S. and military attachés in England, who oversaw the activities of the Allied war machines, they were posturing for that day of infamy. The U.S. became very concerned that Japan had started an expansion plan by taking over northern China and gradually other parts of China and other Indochina properties to the south, leading to embargoes of Japan and retaliation by Japan in blocking trade routes. Finding negotiations to lessen the possible effect of war or chance of war abruptly stopped. They were in Washington, D.C. negotiating, and suddenly they stopped. We're not getting anywhere. The Japanese stayed here in the States as Tojo and his cronies were getting ready to launch an attack on the United States. Folks in the know thought Japan would attack the Philippines, even though Washington had intercepted intelligence that Pearl would be the target. Now this is most important. We say that the Germans made a sneak attack on Hawaii. They did nothing of the sort. We knew they were coming. Intelligence knew they were coming. And I'll go on from there. The information withheld from the commanders in Hawaii became our temporary scapegoats. Because they didn't put up a defense in Hawaii, or very little defense, it was because our commanders there did not know what the people back in Washington, D.C. knew. Like Churchill with Coventry, Roosevelt did not wish to tip the enemy that their intelligence code had been broken. That's most important. You're going to let civilians suffer. You're going to let a lot of military installations suffer so that the enemy does not know that you have broken their intelligence code. Roosevelt did not wish to tip the enemy, and their intelligence code had been broken. About a week or so before the Pearl attacks, the Brits understood that important talks between the U.S. and Japan had failed, and that the Hawaii media was expecting the Japanese to attack almost immediately. Measures of preparation for an attack lay dormant to the naked eye. At 7:55 on Sunday, December 7th, Hawaiian time, the attacks took place, putting into hand a declaration of war against all Allied enemies. Our nation's attitude immediately went into a hawkish stance and played into Roosevelt's plan. World War II, there had been a scattering of wars around the world. World War II caused the World War part of the two to take place. It now became a world war, with many countries of the world involved. Got started. Okay. It was Monday, December 8th in England at 4 p.m., double daylight saving time, when the English heard the BBC announcement the U.S. had finally heard the bugle. The Pearl Harbor attack brought thoughts of the U.S. entering the war in Europe. More recently, as Berlin announced their support of the Japanese. As soon as the Berlin announced they were supporting Japanese, the Brits and everybody else decided that the U.S. time had come for them to enter the war in Europe. The RAF had been using U.S. citizens in the Eagle Squadron with one of our U.S. colonels, an honorary wing commander. Colonel Charles Sweeney had promised me a membership in the illustrious squadron once I had completed my RAF flight training. In short order, by February 1942, saw the U.S. Air Force establishing headquarters at High Wycombe and preparing to face the common enemy. In May 1943, I transferred from the Royal Air Force into the service of my country and completed 35 missions over Europe, flying as a spare gunner and later a togalier, holding the position of a bombardier in the nose of a B-17. I want to thank you all. You're such a wonderful audience, so attentive for having me today.